Good morning. This is week 7 of from BC to ESV. We just have one more week left after this one. Let me begin with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together on this beautiful sunny Sunday morning. Thank you for our ability to study your word, to hear your voice through your word. Give us the increasing ability to know you through your word and to be able to help others to know you, to bring the knowledge of you to a hurting world so that it can know your grace and your love and your comfort. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Again, I have this exercise up here, which I really hope we're going to get to at the end of class today. So we'll see. Looks like the sunny day has beckoned to some people. So we'll see if more people show up. But well, okay. So everybody's out there making potato salad right now, I suppose. All right. Well, I'm going to do a review again, as we have been wont to do here. So, arguably, the greatest archaeological discovery of all time, not counting Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant, was what? Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah, why? Why? What were the Dead Sea Scrolls? So, and why were they so significant? Sure, yeah. So how old are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, now they're about 75.
Okay, but it's a tough crowd. Yeah, I mean they date to around 2,000 years ago. So yeah, I mean it's the oldest Hebrew. They're the oldest Hebrew manuscripts we have of most of the books of the Bible. I'll put it that way. Yeah, just and I mean, there's nothing like it. And then they correspond really closely to the versions of the Hebrew Bible that have been transcribed over thousands of years. So it's a great corroboration of the accuracy. Having said that, there's lots of tiny little differences. And then a few differences that are more than just tiny, but it's just an amazing and important and significant archaeological discovery. What Bible was called the Wicked Bible, and why? Yes, so it was the 1731 edition of the King James Bible, published by Robert Barker, who was the official printer to the King of England, and he unfortunately, and I'm sure inadvertently, left out the word not in the 7th commandment, rendering it, instead of thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt commit adultery. Oh, poor Robert Barker was fined and eventually wound up in debtor's prison. Which English king had 6 wives, and why is that important to the development of the English Bible? Henry VIII. Good. And why was that important, that these wives? What? Well, yeah, sure. I mean, so in a sense, it kicked off the entire English Reformation, which isn't to say that there weren't things going on. I mean, we know that Wycliffe had Reformation ideas hundreds of years before Henry VIII showed up, and there was that underground swell there. But at the top, it was Henry VIII that broke with the Church of England, created the Church of England by breaking with the Catholic Church over the issue of getting a divorce, because he wanted a son and an heir to the throne, and which meant that he divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, married one of her ladies in waiting, Anne Boleyn, and gave birth to a daughter. So bad news for Anne. Off with her head. He goes on and he marries Jane Seymour. She gives him a son. We're not going to go through all the wives again, but I mean, Edward VI becomes the Protestant king that everybody wanted. So there's a lot to do with Henry VIII and the development of the Reformation in England and then the Bible. Okay, who are Westcott and Hort? We talked about this last week, but shows how much. Yes, they published critical Greek text in 1881, and it was an extreme advance over the Greek text that had been used for the King James Bible. So the King James Bible, the Greek text that was used was basically by Erasmus and slightly revised, but it only had just a few, less than 10 Greek manuscripts to work with. And that's called the Textus Receptus. It's still the fundamental building block of the New King James Bible. The New King James Bible, if you're using it, is based on the Textus Receptus. Less than 10 Greek manuscripts. Now we have between 5,000 and 6,000 Greek manuscripts. Yes.
So you use that term Textus Receptus. A lot of people assume that means there's some special God-given authority to it, but it was actually in the intro to the second edition that Erasmus put out, which was not used for King James. So there was a chronological thing, but when the second edition came out, he was saying, hey, I hope you receive this well.
Yeah.
And yet people took that term and just went with it.
Right. Yeah. Good point, Alex. In doing this research, I'm more and more running into the folk that think that the King James. I started this. The whole thing 7 weeks ago. I started off with that flippant slide that said, if the King James Bible is good enough for Jesus, it should be good enough for me. I'm running into more of this. I see more of it out on the internet where there's a lot of folk that they think that there's something super special about King James, that we shouldn't be using any modern translations. And I'm thinking, wow, okay, but how do you reconcile that with the fact that it can't be as accurate as what we have today? The Bibles that we have today are increasingly more and more accurate. The advances in the knowledge of Greek and Hebrew, they made incredible strides, and so they have much more to go on. I think we're getting closer and closer and closer to the original inspired text. I mean, we're really close. But the King James Version just can't be. So I love King James. I mean, I love the language of it, but it's just not accurate. It's as accurate as it could be. Anyway, that's my little sermonette, I guess. What Bible did Charles Spurgeon call strong in Greek, weak in English? The Revised Version of 1881 New Testament, 1885 Complete Bible. That was the first major revision. We talked about this last week. The first major revision of the Bible in like 300 years. Yes, there had been a few other Bibles written between King James and the Revised Version, but none that were really of consequence. None that people really read that much. So the Revised Version was the first big revision to King James, and they did they had much better Greek texts to work with, but they just didn't do a real super good job. They retained a lot of the anachronistic language and constructions and so on, so it just was really hard to read. What Bible renders Genesis 3:7, sewed fig tree leaves together and made themselves breeches? Yes, it was the Geneva Bible. So very good. That was an A for the day. And hence it was called the Breeches Bible sometimes. All right, what was the first Bible to be copyrighted? The Revised, yeah. So the Revised version was the first Bible to be copyrighted by Oxford and Cambridge universities. Okay, very good, class. Gee, there's, yes.
On this subject, a little bit, in one of our book studies that we're going through, Elizabeth Elliot quotes a lot from the New English Bible, which I had
Okay.
never heard of before until this particular book.
Okay. The New English Bible is something that I'm planning, hopefully we'll get to. So we're running out of time. Next week, we definitely have to do the NIV. I'm not going to get to it this week. And I'll try to do the New English Bible. So the New English Bible, so while all this is going, and I'm going to get a little bit, I'm going to, at the end of class today, a little bit, but as all this is going on in the United States, you know, they haven't forgotten about Bibles in England. And so in the 60s, there was an effort to produce a totally new Bible. And they got together a bunch of pretty, you know, really super good, actually it was in the 50s into 60s. I'll have to check the dates on that. But they got together committees of pretty brilliant people, which is the way typically Bibles are written today, committees. And they came out with a Bible that was very highly regarded as far as the literary quality of the Bible. And at first it was fairly popular, but it was English, and it was a little too literary for people's tastes, tended to be. I think it came out in 1970, 71, something like that. She wrote the book in 82. Okay, so, but the New English Bible, so your question again was
I had not heard of it before.
yeah, okay,
And
right.
she, as I say, she quotes
Yeah,
it.
all right. So here's the two, just to give you an idea, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm going to double check this. But if I'm remembering correctly, on the translation committee, and so you know it was well thought of, but not a lot of people have it. I think we have a copy at home. We have a copy of the New English Bible, because I bought most of these Bibles at one point or another. On the translation committee were two people whose names you might recognize, T.S. Eliot and also C.S. Lewis. So, you know, if T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis were on the translation committee, it gives you an idea that it might be a pretty good Bible. So I'll try to deal with that a little bit more next week. Did that answer your question? Helpful. Okay. 61. All right. Okay. Earlier than I thought. So the I don't know if you can see it, but you know, I titled session 7 today of the making of many Bibles. Yeah, it's a little play on words on Ecclesiastes, right? So we're getting a proliferation of Bibles. Yeah. Okay. Moving along. 1952. How many remember 1952? No, you don't. Yeah. Oh, okay. I was going to say you don't have to put up your hands. Well, what was happening in 1952? Dwight Eisenhower was elected president. The Korean War was in its 3rd year. Lucy, I'm Home rang out from living rooms across the nation. Some of you know what that is. Some of you don't. That's okay. Kellogg Corn Flakes was introduced. Yeah. High Noon was playing in movie theaters. The average new home cost $9,000, and gas was 20 cents a gallon. And the Revised Standard Version of the Bible was published. Okay. The Revised Standard Version was a committee Bible. It was intended to be a revision in the tradition of King James and then the Revised Version. So Revised Version, 1885. Revised Standard Version, 1952. The Revised Standard Version was ecumenical. By that I mean it included all denominations, and actually it also included, on the translation committee, it included 32 scholars, one of which was Jewish. So this is not exclusively, a Christian perspective Bible. The copyright was purchased by from the American Standard. Let's go back for just a second. In 1885, the Revised Version was published. That was in Britain. The British were working with Americans on the other side of the pond here, and the Americans published the American Standard Version in 1901. There's very little difference between the two, but there were a few differences. So when I say Revised Version, that's sort of shorthand for the British Revised Version and the American Standard Version of 1901. The International Council of Religious Education, first of all, purchased the copyright, and they were the folk that were initiating this. They thought that there was a need for updating the language, and also because, again, of advances in the scholarship, the Greek and Hebrew scholarship. So after this, Bibles are copyrighted. Almost all Bibles are copyrighted. That makes them intellectual property. So what do we think of that? I know last week Ian came up and talked to me about copyright, and there's some issues about that. Well, it makes the Word of God intellectual property. A lot of people, I think, object to that idea, that the Word of God shouldn't be anybody's property. And also, there's, money changing hands here. So people are paying for access to the Bibles. Is this a good thing, a bad thing, or what do we think? We have no opinion. I bet we have an opinion, but... So, there's financial interests involved here. So when you're looking at the market out there, if you're a Bible publisher, you might be tempted, I suppose, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, which I guess you should never do in church, but what the heck. You might be tempted to do some things that you might not otherwise do because of the market, because you're selling the Bibles. Now, most of these Bible publishers are Christian publishers, and some of them are nonprofits too. So this gets really complex. Copyright is a really complex issue, but copyright means you can't actually take the work and use, let's say, a preponderance of the work without paying attention to the copyright, possibly paying the copyright holder, at least acknowledging that it's copyrighted. So does it bother anybody that Bibles are now copyrighted? Yeah, Alex.
Well, like what you said, to do business in today's world, you need to protect efforts. So that would be the side that says, okay, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Okay. On the other side, though, you could easily get all of the demerits of, hey, you're only in it for the money.
Sure. Yeah.
Especially when you see a particular version in 16 different styles, one for kids, one for teens, one for men, one for women,
Right.
one for people that don't have enough money, whatever.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. So I think there's pros and cons on this issue. I hadn't run into this before. I just run into this where, okay, so the King James version, back to King James, it's not copyrighted. So there's some people who make the inference, well, okay, it must be because, God didn't want it to be copyrighted, and so that's the version we should be using. I throw this out there because I think it's interesting. In any case, all right.
Same thing has happened to Christian music.
Yeah.
Everybody just did it for free.
Right, yeah, and they were into it because the Spirit was moving them, and they wanted to do it for the Lord. Now, it was a big business. Yeah, well, there's that issue too. Okay. So, in 1928, there was a committee established. Now, we're talking about, we're in the United States now, so this is the, they sold the copyright that the International Council of Religious Ed had purchased to Thomas Nelson Publishers. Thomas Nelson is a big religious publisher, to fund the creation of the translation. And you have to pay the translators and the proofwriters and the editors and the people that print the thing. You have to pay them, and so there's a lot of money involved in this. But in exchange for exclusive use by Thomas Nelson for 10 years. So Thomas Nelson gets to use it, and they put up the money. Okay, so what was after the 10 years? I'm not absolutely sure. Let's assume that it probably becomes public domain and anybody can use it. But okay, intellectual property is a little bit, it's something I know a little bit about, having been a librarian. So there's three types of intellectual property, basically. There's trademarks, copyrights, and patents. Drugs are patents. Patents are different. Patents are protected, or patents are mentioned in the Constitution. They run for 17 years, and that's because they want to protect the person who's invented the whatever it is, so that they make the money for the first 17 years, and then the patent is totally gone. Anybody can do it. Copyright is different. Copyright laws are really complex. They've changed over time. Rule of thumb, if it's 100 years old, it's out of copyright. Anybody can take it and use it, and people do, although there's lots of exceptions to that, so it's a pain, really. Did that answer your question? Sort of. No, but that's okay. This is my wife. All right. Yeah, this happens a lot. Okay. Committee Bible, 32 scholars. One was Jewish. They tried to coordinate with the Brits, but the Brits didn't want to do that. They wanted to go off and create their own new Bible. Totally new. They used material that wasn't available to the previous translators. So a lot of manuscripts that they were able, and Greek, texts that they were able to use. And but they had the Dead Sea Scrolls were out there, but they had been really limited in the people that were looking at it hadn't really allowed a whole lot out. So they really weren't able to really utilize the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it was very anticipated. Everybody was excited about this new translation. But what then happened was there was a big controversy. And when I say a fiery controversy, I mean there were a couple pastors in different parts of the United States that burned it publicly. One had his congregation take it out and everybody burned it. Another one burned it with a blowtorch, put the ashes in a box, and sent them to the chairman of the translation committee, who apparently still kept it. You can still go look at it. I think it's at Yale. Calling it a heretical, communist-inspired Bible. Cold War's going on. And why? Well, here's some of the things. The translation substituted the word expiation for propitiation at Romans 3:25, Hebrews 2:17, 1 John 2:2, and 4:10. They omitted the phrase "through his blood" at Colossians 1:14. They omitted the eunuch's response in Acts at 8:37, and there were a large number of deviations from the standard Hebrew translation. But there was an even bigger issue, which we're just about to look at. Nevertheless, it was very well received, generally speaking. It sold 30 million copies up to 1974, and 55 million copies by 1990. That's a lot of copies. And the reaction to the RSV among the, let's say, more conservative evangelical folk was one of the principal reasons for the creation of the NIV and the ESV. So here's one, well, let's look here. So here's the revised version, right? Sorry, I do this to myself all the time. So now we have the revised version, we have the revised standard version, and we're going to have the new revised standard version. So the revised standard version now, 1952, renders Isaiah 7:14 as, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and call his name Emmanuel." Then you can see the King James up there, and the ESV. There is a somewhat significant difference. Does anybody see a problem? I'll bet we do. What's the problem? Yeah, calling virgin a young woman. Why would that upset people?
Because we say Jesus was born of a virgin.
Sure.
And this would wipe that problem.
Exactly. It challenges the theology of the virgin birth. This is a significant difference. And you'll hear this today, by the way. If you go out and you may see some secular critics of Christianity, and they'll say, well, you know, Isaiah 7:14 actually says young woman, not virgin. So that's out there, even people that don't know much about what they should before they shoot their mouth off. So all this hinges on the translation of two Hebrew words. One is Alma and one is Betula. And this starts to get pretty complex. People want to simplify this. Using the Hebrew word Alma, they think, discredits the virgin birth because that seems to imply young woman. And the thought is Betula is the Hebrew word that says virgin. But there's a problem with that, and you can see it here. So under the column that has Alma at the top, it says, "I came to the spring and said, Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, if now you are prospering the way that I go, behold, I am standing by the spring of water. Let the Alma who comes out to draw water, to whom I shall say, please give me a little water from your jar to drink." That's Genesis 24:42-43. But if you look at the column that has Betula at the top, it says, "The young woman was very attractive in appearance. Betula, whom no man had known, she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up." Genesis 24:16. Both of these passages are referring to Rachel. And they use different words. They use Betula and they use Alma. And it's really ambiguous as to, what these things mean in these contexts. So in different contexts, the words are used more or less interchangeably. Nobody really knows. And Betula supposedly meaning virgin. You notice that in the passage it says, "A Betula whom no man had known." That's superfluously redundant, right? You don't need that. If the word Betula means virgin, you could just read it, "A virgin, she went down to the spring," okay? So that's sort of an indication maybe it doesn't mean exactly that. So you see that the problem here, this is a very complex issue, and Hebrew scholars, they don't agree on this. The context, can sometimes strongly imply one or the other, and sometimes it doesn't. Septuagint. Everybody remembers the Septuagint. What's the Septuagint? The Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures written in Egypt with a Latin name. Yeah. Very important. The Septuagint authors, and done, like 200, 250 BC. The Septuagint authors translated the word alma as parthenos, Greek. So they looked at the word alma, they said this means parthenos. Parthenos clearly in Greek means virgin. And also, Luke, who is especially acting as a reporter of history, recounts the virgin conception and never cites Isaiah's prophecy. Okay. So testimony to the virgin birth can stand completely apart from Matthew's interpretation of Isaiah. So, probably it was a bit of a tempest in a teapot, but there you go. At the time, a lot of evangelicals complained. They asked the RSV committee if they would make changes, and the RSV committee, this great Christian charity, said no. Go pound sand. So they went out. This is how we're going to get the NIV and the ESV. All right, who did this to us? Here's a list. So now these days, with the modern versions, we can know who wrote the translation. And so here's a list of the translators. Couple points. When I was a librarian and I was teaching folks how to do research, there's one thing that I emphasize, fairly simple as far as finding reliable information. So, you try to teach some 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds how to research stuff, and of course they think they know how to, yes, the Wikipedia. No, present company accepted, but you know what I'm saying. You've probably seen this. Anyway, so here's the deal. So, who wrote it? Identify who wrote it. There's actually a fairly some easy tricks to do. Like you see on the internet. Here's an amazing hack. Well, there are some amazing hacks. Who wrote it? So that's fundamental. In fact, it's so fundamental, I'd like you to repeat this after me. Who wrote it? I'd like you to repeat this after me. Who wrote it?
Who wrote it?
Good. Why did they write it?
Why?
Why did they write it? And who did they write it for? Good. All right. Everybody gets an A.
And when did they write it?
Well, Dan, that's not a bad additional question, actually. So with the RSV, we know who wrote it. And you can see that we've got people up there from places like Yale, Harvard, Union Theological Seminary, right? So this tells us a little bit about what the perspective is. Now, I've worked with a lot of people with advanced degrees, and some of them are extremely bright, but not all. And usually they know their subjects really well. But I've seen some of the biggest dunderheads. So keep that in mind. But these are not people that just fell off the turnip truck. I mean, they know these languages. They know what they're talking about as far as the languages go, but it's always a matter of interpretation. Remember, all translation is interpretation. But it does give you an idea of who's responsible, and that's a good thing. All right.
You got guys up there that, like Miller Burroughs died in 1938.
Mm-hmm.
Most published in 52, so they were working on that for at least 14 years before.
Miller Burroughs joined the committee in 38.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. In fact, here, so let me go to the next. Yeah. So 8 years before. Right, yeah, so they were working on it. They were working on it for, somewhere I had that. It was quite a while. They started before World War II. And World War II interrupted things. Here's a bit about I just picked a couple of these guys. So Burroughs was an undergraduate at Cornell, a bachelor's in divinity, was an ordained minister. He worked in Presbyterian churches, rural Texas, earned a PhD at Yale. His dissertation was the literary relations of Ezekiel. He was one of the editors of the Cave 1 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, again, this guy just didn't fall off the turnip truck into this committee. James Moffat, professor of Greek and New Testament exegesis at Mansfield College, Oxford. You probably can't get any better than that in Greek. 27 to 39, he was the Washburn Professor of Church History at the Union Theological Seminary. He wrote his own translation, the Moffat Bible. I don't think anybody really reads that, but no. But he did. Now, there's a problem. Here's the problem that I see starting to creep into this. Moffat's Bible, if we look at Moffat's Bible, had some very quirky assumptions. And apparently he did not hold to biblical infallibility or the historicity of the Bible. When I say historicity, do we know what that word means? Historicity, it's a great word. It means the accuracy, the authenticity of the historical events. So, in other words, he's saying, well, like Exodus didn't take place, or it didn't take place when we think it took place. He's challenging the historicity. This is one of the guys that's translating it. Yeah, this bothers me. And, some of these things were sort of a revelation. Bruce Metzger, I don't have his name up there, but Bruce Metzger, Metzger, was also on the committee. I'm going to talk about him more in just a minute. And I'm going to move to the New Revised Standard Version, which was published in 1989. So we had the Revised Version, the Revised Standard Version, and now we have the New Revised Standard Version. They're all in the same line of descent from King James, Revised Version, Revised Standard Version. Now we have the New Revised Standard Version. Okay? Sponsored and copyrighted by the National Council of Churches. Now you would think the National Council of Churches, that sounds good, doesn't it? Does anybody know anything about the National Council of Churches? Yes, I think so. I think there are fairly, these terms are loaded, but fairly left-wing sort of an organization at this point in time. This Bible included not only Protestant, but also Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Jewish scholars. So what's the inference we might draw from that? What?
You have to make everybody happy.
Everybody happy. Well, there's two things in the balance here. One is different perspectives and different, backgrounds in these scholastic folk. But the other one is this is not necessarily going to reflect maybe the Christian theology as much as it might reflect some other theologies.
Well, it would need to support the church polity that each of those different divisions had.
Good point. So Alex said. Right, Alex said, so it has to support the church polity of all these organizations. Have you ever noticed, it seems to me, now this is totally my humble opinion, but as you get upwards in, churches that have hierarchical structures, and you get up to the national, international organizations, they tend to be kind of a little off direction from what the actual folks on the ground think about stuff. That's my observation. But here's another problem. One of the secretaries to this translation committee was a guy who he was a scholar, but he was just a little junior scholar, just a little bitty scholar, so they made him secretary. But he was going to grow up to be a great big grown-up scholar. And his name was Bart Ehrman. Does anybody recognize that name? Well, Bart is a notorious, infamous biblical scholar who's published a bunch of, unfortunately, influential books, best-selling books, and he's either an atheist or an agnostic. And he's on the translation committee. He's a guy that tries to tear down Christianity, in my opinion. He's talked about parts of the Bible are just forgeries, or they weren't actually written by who we think they were written by, and things like that. So Bart Ehrman was on the translation committee. Does that scare anybody? But it should just scare you right down to your tips of your socks. There were 30 members on this committee. I didn't put up the names, but you can get to the names if you want to. 30 members, including 4 women scholars, several of whom are self-described feminists. Does that bother anybody? Oh, yeah, I think it should. Now, Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger is actually the author of a book that I've read several times for preparation for this class on Bible translations, and it's pretty good stuff. He's a professor. He was a professor. He's passed away now. He lived into his 90s. Passed away maybe 10 years ago. He was the author of many books. He was an expert on Greek. He worked on one of the critical Greek editions of the New Testament that's used today. Now, there are several Greek New Testaments that are being used today. They still use Westcott and Hort. There's something called it's just called the Critical Edition, and then there's one called Nestle and Alland. And Nestle and Alland is probably the one that's the most used, I think. I don't read Greek. It's in like the 28th edition. So every time they come up with more manuscripts, more scholarship or whatever, they publish a new edition of Nestle and Alland. So we really keep up with what's going on in Greek. So Metzger was an expert at Greek, an expert at the New Testament. He was the chair of the committee. So he was the chair of the committee. He was also previously, back in 1952, he was on the Revised Standard Version translation. He was one of the translators. So he's got a long history with this. Metzger was one of those, rare birds. He worked at Princeton Theological Seminary for 46 years and did not lose his faith. That was supposed to be a joke. But maybe not. However, it really appears to me that, although, a brilliant scholar, he was theologically pretty liberal and I don't think he supported biblical infallibility or biblical historicity. I can do this. Historicity. He didn't support historicity. So, at best, he was pretty thin gruel. Okay. Questions, comments, observations, reactions. I'm looking for outrage and awesome awestruckness and some oh my goshes, but we'll get it. I'll come on. It's coming up here. We'll get it. Maybe we'll get it. There we go. So here's another Bible in the tradition of King James, Revised Standard Version, a Reader's Digest Bible. Has anybody ever seen this? It was fairly popular. So they took the Revised Standard Version and they used that. The general editor was Bruce Metzger. So he worked on the Revised Standard, the New Revised Standard, and now general editor for the Reader's Digest Bible. It cut 50% of the Old Testament. It cut 25% of the New Testament. It cut out chapters and verses, and none of the words of Jesus were changed, but 10% were deleted. I am at a loss for words. Actually, I'm not at a loss for words. But don't even think about it, right? I mean, an idea so dumb it ruptures the fabric of time and space. Why would you ever do this? Money, okay, sure. You know, this brilliant scholar from Yale bought into this. Is there anything that justifies, something like this?
People look at the Bible as a huge thing that who's going to read it. So if you can summarize it and get the main thought across, maybe that'll be attractive.
Yeah? Better to read that than nothing. Cliff Notes for the Bible.
The Reader's Digest condensed version, that's a standard. They take all these, novels.
Right. Well, maybe it is better than nothing. I don't know. How did they decide which 10% of what Jesus said wasn't worth putting in the Bible? I don't know, but yeah. But you will see it out there. And apparently, I don't have a copy of this, but apparently it's fairly large. It's about 10 by 7, so it's a good-sized Bible. No chapter and verse numbers, and it's got a lot of illustrations in it. Okay. The ESV. All right. How did we get the ESV? Well, it came out of a meeting in 1997 at Colorado Springs at the headquarters for Focus on the Family, where they developed the guidelines. At that meeting, among other people, there were Wayne Grudem. Anybody recognize Wayne Grudem? James Dobson, R.C. Sproul, John Piper, and some other people. So you get the idea of who's behind this. This was reaction. It was a reaction to the New Revised Standard. And it was a committee Bible. They invited about 100 scholars and some of the very best evangelical Bible scholars from around the world, and we can get a list of these folk if we want to. Additional review and input was provided by a 60-member advisory committee. There was a 12-member translation oversight committee with Dr. J.I. Packer as the general editor, which carried out the overall work of revision, review, and final approval. And I'm quoting from the ESV website. Now, this is a Bible that we have a website for, which is interesting. Actually, I'm sorry, I back up. I'm quoting from a website called BibleResearcher.com. It's about the ESV translators, but we can get to the ESV website these days. Okay, response to the NIV and the NRSV. With a big thing that was provoking this, well, there was more than one thing, but one of the biggest issues was regendered language and also questionable theology. So what do we mean when we say regendered language? Regendered language. Yeah. So we say, so regendering it would make it what? People, okay. Any other examples you can think of? Yeah, instead of where the Bible actually says brothers, they put in brothers and sisters. So they took the liberty of adding in and sisters. Now, is that justifiable?
Yes.
Sometimes.
Didn't necessarily mean just males.
Yeah, I agree with you.
The word there just says, it's more like just people.
I agree with you, except that there are certain contexts where it might only have been applied to brothers. And it goes beyond that. So there were people that were part of the New Revised Standard and some of the later versions that, let's say, where it says God the Father, they would like to say God the... just God, or God the Mother, or things like that. God the Parent, yeah. So this raised a big spat here, and so this is one of the reasons we have the ESV. I'm going to quote here at some length from the preface to the ESV. If you've never read the preface to your Bible that you're using, I encourage you to do that, because usually the preface lays out who did it, why did they do it, and who did they do it for. In the area of gender language, the goal of the ESV is to render literally what is in the original. For example, anyone replaces any man, where there is no word corresponding to man in the original languages. And people, rather than men, is regularly used where the original languages refer to both men and women. But the words man and men are retained where a male meaning component is part of the original Greek or Hebrew. Likewise, the word man has been retained where the original text intends to convey a clear contrast between God on the one hand and man on the other hand, with man being used in the collective sense of the whole human race. Similarly, the English word brothers, translating the Greek word adelphoi, is retained as an important familial form of address between fellow Jews and fellow Christians in the first century. A recurring note is included to indicate that the term brothers, adelphoi, was often used in Greek to refer to both men and women, and to indicate the specific instances in the text where this is the case. In addition, the English word sons, translating the Greek word huia, is retained in specific instances because the underlying Greek term usually includes a male meaning component, and it was used as a legal term in the adoption and inheritance laws of first century Rome. As used by the Apostle Paul, this term refers to the status of all Christians, both men and women, who, having been adopted into God's family, now enjoy all the privileges, obligations, and inheritance rights of God's children. The inclusive use of the generic he has also regularly been retained because this is consistent with similar usage in the original languages and because an essential literary translation would be impossible without it. In each case, the objective has been transparency to the original text, allowing the reader to understand the original on its own terms rather than in terms of our present-day Western culture. So this is a big dividing line now in Bible translations. Okay, it was published by Crossway Publishers. It's a Christian publisher. It's a nonprofit effort, and they donate a portion of each purchase of the ESV to help support Bible distribution ministry around the world. So you can go to the Crossway, and Crossway is owned by the Good News Company, which is also a Christian organization. And you can go to the ESV website, and you can read all this stuff about the translation. Okay, technically speaking, we've made it from BC to ESV, but you might have noticed that there are a lot more Bibles out there we haven't talked about yet. What is missing, which we haven't discussed yet? I love that, nearly inspired version. I like that, Chris. Yeah, okay, good news. Yes, we have good news today. Living Bible, Phillips. Well, okay, so let's see here. There are a bunch, so we're going to try to get to that. NASB. So this is also in the line of descent. So I'm going to try to finish out the line of descent from King James to Revised Standard to New Revised Standard, and so on. Oh, okay. And I'm going to go really fast. Okay, so this is a revision of the American Standard Version, which is basically the Revised Version. It was published by the Lockman Foundation. That was a nonprofit Christian educational organization based in California. It is another committee Bible. There were 58 translators, originally anonymous, but the translators later were revealed. All were conservative Bible scholars with doctorates and so on, or other degrees in biblical languages and theology. One example, Bruce Waltke, professor of Old Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary and other colleges. He had his PhD from Harvard. He was author of many books, worked on both the NASB and the NIV. There were a wide variety of Protestant-only denominations represented: Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Nazarenes, and so forth. Strengths and weaknesses, and you decide. So, what's a strength? It's considered to have maybe the most excellent cross-references that were ever put into the Bible. Utilized the up-to-date advances and discoveries. It's got an evangelical perspective. Weaknesses, it's hard to read. Why? Well, its aim is to be very formal. So, it wants to represent the Greek the way the Greek was, tenses, syntax, and so forth. Uses Lord for the Tetragrammaton. So it's interesting, that's a reversion back. So the ASV had changed from Lord to Jehovah. Now they're changing back from Jehovah to Lord.
If I understand correctly, the new Legacy Bible, NASB,
Okay.
goes back to using Yahweh.
Yahweh. Well, I guess we just can't make up our minds here. I don't know if anybody has a strong opinion on this or not, but, no, I'm not going to go down that little rabbit trail. Quotations from the Old Testament and the New Testament are printed in small caps. King James's thou, thine, and thee is only used when they're talking in prayers to God, and each verse begins on a new line. So those are the you decides. Okay. Amplified Bible. So an Amplified Bible was a revision of the ASV. It was published and copyrighted by the Lockman Foundation, same people that just did the NASB. It was another committee Bible. And this is an example. How many of you have used the Amplified Bible? My wife. Oh, Kathy, maybe Alex. All right. So here's an example, John 3:16. For God so greatly loved and dearly prized the world that he, even, gave up his only begotten, unique Son, so that whoever believes in, trusts, clings to, relies on him, shall not perish, come to destruction, be lost, but have eternal, everlasting life. What do you think? Gary says, thumbs down. Yeah, okay. So again, I think pros and cons here. If you want some of the nuances in the wording, sure. But that means nobody's really, decided what they really think that word means. So if it means one thing more than it means another, you've got all these different possibilities. You don't really know what this particular version really thinks that it means. And then to read it is just like gobbledygook. I mean, you're never going to read this out loud. So what could it be used for? Like a study Bible. I mean, it actually says up there, Amplified Study Bible. So I think that's the niche for the Amplified Bible. And you will see the Amplified Bible out there. Okay, here's a descent of Bibles. Now this is this chart I'm going to give out. This is oversimplified. And I chose this intentionally. You can go out on the internet. You can find gazillions of these charts of how the Bible was. You guys want to take yours and pass those around. How the Bible was, how Bibles are related to each other. And, What this shows is, first of all, there's two, I think, important things that we can see from this chart. First of all, is all these Bibles here are based on the Textus Receptus. So you got Tyndale's Bible, Coverdale, the Geneva Bible. There's some others in here that they're not showing. And then King James, and then New King James. I mean, New King James is still based on the Textus Receptus. Over here, all these Bibles are based on critical Greek and Hebrew texts that we now have much better understanding of. The other thing it shows is the descent from this King James tradition down to King James, and then over here to the Revised Version of 1881 to 1885, and then it goes to the American Standard Version, the New American Standard Version. Now, this doesn't show, right here, branches off here to the Revised Standard Version. It doesn't show the New Revised Standard Version in here. This doesn't show the Amplified, and it doesn't show the Reader's Digest. But they're also in this tradition. And then so is the ESV. So these are all in the tradition of King James, ultimately, well, and actually all the way up to Tyndale. They're all revisions, really. So these Bibles over here are completely and totally different and new traditions, totally new translations. They go back to the beginning and start over again with a totally new look at the Greek and Hebrew. So that's what we're going to talk about mostly next week. Questions?
Yeah. So our goal is to know what the original hearers heard, so we can understand what God was trying to say and so forth. So I find it intriguing, this will maybe get the Christian politics in it. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, he gives a list of people that he's put in place to help the church, apostles, prophets, and he ends with two words. In almost every English translation says pastors and teachers. Okay? ESV says shepherds and teachers with a footnote says pastor. So Tyndale had it shepherds and teachers. When you get to Geneva with all that group of intellectuals, they changed it and used the Latin pastor instead of translating it to English shepherd. Okay, and that's then gone through the whole thing that way. And I'm just thinking how different our culture, Christian culture, would be today if we didn't ever use the word pastor because it wasn't original.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a significant difference.
And the same with the word slave.
Yes, it's true. There's, it is, and that's a significant difference. Okay. Yeah, good point. So in Ephesians, we have at the very end of, what was the reference again, Alex?
4:11.
At 4:11, at the very end, we have the difference between pastors and shepherds. Pastors and shepherds, yeah. Okay. Meanwhile, across the pond, something completely different. Jolly old England. I'm going to say one more thing about the Amplified Bible that I didn't say. One of the authors that I was reading said, a man named David Dewey said that reading the Amplified Bible is like swallowing a thesaurus. Okay. So, the New Testament in Modern English by J.B. Phillips, 1958. This is what I'm going to call a Lone Ranger Bible. One guy. We have not really had one guy who wrote a significant and important Bible that a lot of people read since going back to like Rogers, Coverdale, and Tyndale. So 400 years. Pretty different. Now we're going to find a couple other Lone Ranger Bibles coming up. So who was Phillips? John Bertram Phillips. He was a vicar of the Church of the Good Shepherd in London, England, during World War II. He became convinced of the need for a more accessible translation because of the young people he was working with, they weren't into the King James, which is what they were still using. And so he published translation serially, that is, didn't come out, he came out with it part at a time. He began with Colossians in 1943, and then the remaining epistles in 1947, Gospels in 52, Acts in 55, Revelation also in, that may be a mistake. I think Revelation in 58. In any case, he came out with a complete New Testament by 1958, and he later worked on the Old Testament. He never finished that. He was a brilliant scholar. He had been at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, majored in classics. Now this brings us, he published 18 books, including an autobiography, Ring of Truth, A Translator's Testimony, which is this little book here. And I recommend you read this book. It was a very successful translation, but later in life he suffered tremendously from severe clinical depression, and he saw a ghost. Maybe. It was very intense for Phillips, which brings us to our C.S. Lewis moment. In 1943, Phillips wrote to Lewis, whose work Phillips had admired. In the letter, he included a copy of his translation of Colossians, the first thing that he translated. Lewis' response was all the encouragement he needed to begin what would begin his life's work. Lewis wrote back saying, "Thank you 100 times. It was like seeing an old picture after it's been cleaned." And I'm taking this from a web page that was produced or written by Phillips's grandson. By 46, Phillips had translated all the epistles and titled them as letters to young churches. But he kept getting rejection slips from publishers. But, encouraged by Lewis, with a letter of introduction, Phillips met with Lewis's publisher, Jeffrey Bless, who agreed to publish his book. Now, the ghost story. Well, first of all, let's look at this for a second again. In this book, he talks about the whole translation experience. It says translating the Bible brought him closer to God and reinforced his faith. This is at a time a lot of people were becoming very skeptical. He said something, I'm going to paraphrase to the effect that translating the New Testament was like putting your hands on the live wires of an electrical circuit, and that's how much power and how much it affected him. So in the book, this is quoting, a few days after C.S. Lewis passed away, I was watching television in my living room, sitting in a chair. And just suddenly, C.S. Lewis appeared within a few feet of me and spoke a few words which were particularly relevant to the difficult circumstances through which I was passing. He was ruddier in complexion than ever, grinning all over his face, and as the old-fashioned saying has it, positively glowing with health. The interesting thing, and he was dead, right? The interesting thing to me was that I had not been thinking about him at all. I was neither alarmed nor surprised. He was just there. Large as life and twice as natural. A week later, this time when I was in bed reading, he appeared again, even more rosily radiant than before, and repeated to me the same message, which was very important to me at the time. Now, there's another author, Marie A. Kahn, has a book, C.S. Lewis and Human Suffering, Light Among the Shadows. She reports that Phillips was struggling with the clinical depression at that particular time, and Lewis twice repeated this phrase, "It's not as hard as you think," which was a great comfort to Phillips at that time. And here's some examples. So, at Romans 16:16, ESV has greet one another with a holy kiss. All the churches of Christ greet you. KJV, salute one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ salute you. Phillips Give each other a hearty handshake all around for my sake. The greetings of all the churches I am in touch with come to you with this letter. James 1:2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. KJV. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. Phillips. When all kinds of trials and temptations crowd into your lives, my brothers, don't resent them as intruders, but welcome them as friends. What do you think? Not quite as bad as the message. Okay. So some people see this as a paraphrase. Phillips was a Greek scholar. He was working with the Greek. He does put it in pretty colloquial terms. So is he taking too many liberties?
Well, that's why I asked if it was a real translation.
He went back to the Greek and translated in his own fashion, trying to get something that he thought was appealing and accessible. So again, we have to decide in our own minds, is this justifiable? Maybe he's taking some of those Greek terms and using English words that aren't maybe the best corresponding word, but really represent the meaning. So again, we get to this division between formal and dynamic, word for word, thought for thought, form-driven, meaning-driven. Oh, and I know everybody has to go. Let's see, just a picture. That's J.B. Phillips on the left, C.S. Lewis on the right. And here's previews of coming attractions for next week. Yeah. Okay. Dear Lord, thank you for this day, this time together, and bless us as we go through our week. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.